En la mar hay una torre. En la torre hay una ventana. En la ventana hay una niña que a los marineros llama. Once there was a sultan, so powerful that his armies made the world tremble. A sultan, a king so wealthy, his treasury was the envy of other kings. But a sultan whose heart was always so heavy, heavy as lead, because not once had he been visited by the simple joy of living. But one day it was announced that a baby girl was born to this king. And when the Sultan heard this news of his newly arrived daughter, his heart began to dance like that of a young man. He couldn't wait. He couldn't wait to bring his baby daughter before the soothsayers and fortune tellers to predict her future. But when he did so, there they all were, shaking their heads gravely, saying the same thing. "Your Majesty," they said, "your daughter has a golden future ahead of her." "Your Majesty," they said, "your daughter will become more beautiful with each day that you love her." But alas, who will protect your daughter from the snake that strikes her the day she comes of age? Who will protect your daughter from the snake that strikes her the day she comes of age? Now when the king heard these words, darkness came over his eyes. He couldn't stop thinking. He could stop thinking of the terrible fate in store for his beloved daughter. He thought about it all day when he was in his divan, in his assembly. He thought about it all night as he tossed and turned in bed. But then one night the Sultan had a dream. And in his dream he saw a tower emerge from the depths of the ocean, rising higher and higher and higher until it brushed against the sky. A tower so bright it was the envy of the moon itself. And surrounding the tower was the stormy sea itself, surging and receding around it. Now when the king woke up from this dream, at once he cried out, Es con una torre que puedo trocarle el coral de mi hija. It is after all with a tower that I can change this terrible fate of my daughter. And so at once the king ordered that a tower be built. A tower be built in the middle of the sea. And there it was, rising higher and higher above the island until it brushed against the sky. And when it was completed, he had his daughter brought over to that tower on that island in the middle of the sea. And to that tower he brought everything his daughter needed: seamstresses and maids and pastry cooks and teachers, everything. And there is where the king's daughter grew up, in that lonely tower in the middle of the sea. Now among the teachers that the king sent to that island was an art master who taught his daughter the art of painting. And one day the king's daughter made a portrait of herself, a portrait so lifelike that if one were to look into it, one would think that the princess was standing there right in front of them. And when the portrait was completed, she inscribed the following words in gold letter at the bottom of the frame of that painting. And the words read like this: para el mejor padre del mundo, for the best father in the world, para el mejor padre del mundo. And then she had that portrait sent to her father. And when the Sultan had that portrait in front of him, he began to weep. It was as if his daughter was standing right in front of him. How beautiful she had grown since the last time he saw her, when she was just but a baby. And once he had that portrait in his hands, he could not part with it. He brought it with him everywhere. He brought it with him to the divan, to the assembly, when he discussed the affairs of state with his ministers. He brought it even on his many military campaigns. Now, it was during this time that the Sultan was engaged in a fierce war with the Shah of Persia. And there was a time in the war where the Shah was having the upper hand. He chased the Sultan in one of their battles, chased him so fiercely that the Sultan and his soldiers abandoned their tents, leaving everything behind. And it was during such an attack that the Shah's son entered the abandoned camp of the Sultan and his soldiers. And the Shah's son, the Prince of Persia, made his way to that tent of cloth of gold, which indeed belonged to no other, he thought, than the Sultan. And when he entered that tent, he saw there a portrait of the most beautiful woman he had ever seen. And at the bottom of the frame of that portrait, he read those words in gold letter, para el mejor padre del mundo. And at once he understood that this portrait could be none other than the portrait of the daughter of the Sultan himself. And so at once he went to his father, the Shah, and he begged with him to end this war with the Sultan. Pedar, father, he said, we must end this senseless war with our neighbor, the Sultan. Please let us cease the war at once. End the war, roared the Shah. My son, have you lost your mind? Now I have the upper hand. One more battle and I will crush this Sultan once and for all. Pedar, father, pleaded the prince, please do this for my sake. End the war. I will go to Istanbul, and when I come back, I will explain to you everything. Well, the Shah, who loved his son more than anything in the world, could not even refuse him this. And so the Prince of Persia made his way to the city of Istanbul with that portrait of the princess tucked under his arm. Now, when he arrived in the great city of Istanbul, he asked everyone showing the portrait, asking them where he could find this beautiful woman who had taken his heart. Every person he showed that portrait to shook their heads with a certain weariness. Mansevo, young man, what you are looking for is impossible. Mansevo, young man, what you're looking for is as possible as drawing water from the moon. Abandon this pointless search and go back home. But the prince's heart was so brimming with love for this princess, whose portrait he was holding in his hands, that he could not abandon his search, ever. And so day after day he asked again and again, and there were those same weary sighs, those same heads shaking back and forth, until a day came when he felt he had lost all hope. He was sitting on a bench, and as he was sitting there, at the corner of his eye, he saw an old woman carrying a heavy burden of branches on her back as she walked across the street. And when he noticed her, in that moment he forgot his own despair, and at once he approached the old woman. "Abuela, Granny," he said to her, "that burden is way too heavy for you. Let me carry it for you to your door." And at once the prince swung the burden on his own back, and the old woman led him back to her own door. And then and only then the prince released himself of this burden. And the old woman looked up to the tall, young, handsome prince, and she said to him, "Mansevo, young man, how many people have seen me carry this heavy burden, and it is only you who noticed me. For this, ask me anything, and I promise I will not refuse it to you." Well, at once the prince showed the old woman that portrait of the beautiful princess, and she smiled sadly as she looked into it. And he said to her, "Abuela, Granny, you must tell me where I can find her. For until the day I look upon her eyes, I will not live." And so the old woman led the young man down the winding streets of the city, out through the gates of that city, until they found themselves at the shore of the sea. And from there in the distance could be seen that tower that emerged from the middle of the sea. And she pointed to that tower, saying, "Mansevo, young man, alas, it is in that tower where you will find what you are seeking. But beware, young man, beware, for no one is allowed to make their way to that tower. And by the Sultan's orders, anyone who dares do so will pay for it with their life." But the prince, whose heart was brimming with love, barely heeded the warning of the old woman, for the next day he found himself a boat. And with that boat he rowed on that boat across the sea until he made his way right beneath the terrace of the high tower above, that tower in the middle of the sea. And when his boat was placed there, right underneath the terrace above, he began singing a song that went like this: "Todo no es suerte, mi buena amiga, mi buena amiga. Ya vi torres altas que un día brillaron juntito al sol, que brillaron juntito al sol." He sang that song again and again to that empty terrace above, day after day. But then one day the princess emerged on the terrace, for she was wondering who was serenading to her day after day all this time. And when she looked down there, she saw him, the handsome tall prince in his boat. And she cried down to that prince, "Mansevo, young man, what are you doing? Why do you come here every day serenading to me with the same song?" And below, the young man called up, "Lustra, princess," he said to her, "I come here every day after all to wait for the day that you will descend from this tower and join me in this boat so that we can return to the world together." "Mansevo, young man," replied the princess wearily. "Young man, don't you understand that it is my fate? It is my fate to remain in this lonely tower forever." "Lustra, princess," replied the prince, "if that is indeed your fate, then it is my fate to come here every day, waiting for the day that you will join me in this boat, so that we can return to the world together. And so day after day, the prince continued to make his way to the tower and serenade to the princess above in her lonely tower. Then the time came that the princess had finally come of age. And on that day, the Sultan's heart was dancing with joy. I have averted the terrible fate of my daughter, he said to himself again and again. I have done it. And in his joy, he arranged that a royal barge be prepared, a royal barge which he had filled with all that was needed for a great celebration on the island where the tower was to be found. And into that barge came musicians and pastry cooks and everything of the like that was needed for a great celebration. And in all that hustle and bustle, the Prince of Persia found his way to slip into that royal barge without anyone noticing. The barge slowly sailed across the sea towards the tower in the middle of it. And when it disembarked, the prince was the first to leave the ship, and no one noticed him again. And he ran towards the tower. He was the first to arrive there. And his arms were burdened with countless fresh red roses. And he ran up the spiral staircase of the tower, and at the top of it, there was the chambers of the princess, and he swung that door open, and he placed all those roses at her feet. And she clapped her hands in delight. But her moment of delight did not last long. For from the roses there was something that slithered from within it. It was a serpent, and quickly it slithered its way towards the princess and bit her on the ankle. And the snake's venom quickly did its work on the princess as life was being seeped away from her. And the prince looked on in despair. He ran to her and held her in his arms as life was seeping away from her. He began to weep. Illustra, O princess, he said, if it is your fate to die today, then it is my fate. It is my fate to join you in this death. And so at once he went to where the snake had bitten her, and he tried to drink the venom himself so that he could die with his true love. But every time he tried to draw in the venom from the princess's wound, the venom was so bitter he had to spit it out. He did this again and again, until at that moment the Sultan and his wife walked through the door. And what did the Sultan see there but his daughter, the princess, her lifeless body in the arms of a strange man whose lips were smeared with blood. His despair at that moment was indescribable, and his despair became rage. At once he ordered his guards to throw chains over this young man and drag him to a sure death. And the prince, who was so filled with despair, did not resist the guards of the Sultan as they took him away. And slowly they all left the room. The Sultan was the last to leave. And as he was taking his last steps out the door, from behind his back he heard a faint cry. Baba! Baba! At once the Sultan turned, and there he saw that his daughter was coming to life again. He ran to her side, and she smiled with him, her eyes filled with life again. Baba, Daddy, please Please don't take that man away, for it is because of him that I am alive, for he drew the poison from my own body. This young man is after all the son of your most bitter enemy. He is after all the son of the Shah of Persia." The Sultan, the king, was so overjoyed to have his daughter return to him alive in his own arms, that he couldn't refuse the hand in marriage of his beloved daughter to the Prince of Persia. And so Kirkegun ve Kirkegede, for 40 days and 40 nights there were celebrations throughout the kingdom, celebrations for the marriage of the princess and the Prince of Persia. And after the celebrations, the princess returned with her husband to his own kingdom. And soon after that, she became a queen. And not long after that, she became the mother of kings. And from that time forward, in her new life with the prince, never again was she ever a stranger. Never again was she ever a stranger to the simple joy of living. Y ellos tengan bien y nosotros también. And so they lived happily, and may it be the same for us.